Alessandro Toretti stood on the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York City. The bright lights made his silver hair shine like metal. Thousands of people sat in red velvet seats, waiting for him to move his hands. When he lifted his long white stick called a baton, the whole place became quiet. Even the sound of breathing stopped. The orchestra members held their instruments ready. Violins, cellos, flutes, and trumpets all waited for his signal. These were some of the best musicians in the world, but they all looked at Alessandro like children waiting for their teacher to speak. Alessandro smiled. He loved this feeling. He loved being the most important person in the room. He loved how everyone needed him to make the music happen. Without him, these talented musicians were just people holding expensive instruments. He had been conducting orchestras for 22 years. During that time, he had never failed to master a piece of music. Other conductors sometimes struggled with difficult compositions, but not Alessandro. He could look at any musical score and understand it completely. He could make any orchestra play exactly the way he wanted. The newspapers called him a genius. Music magazines put his picture on their covers. Rich people paid thousands of dollars just to watch him conduct. He had conducted in London, Paris, Vienna, and Tokyo. Every major orchestra in the world wanted to work with him. Alessandro was born in a small town in Italy. His father sold vegetables at the local market. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. They were not rich, but they loved music. His mother would sing old Italian songs while she worked. His father would whistle classical melodies he heard on the radio when Alessandro was 7 years old. His parents took him to see an orchestra performance in the big city nearby. He had never seen anything like it. The conductor stood in front of all those musicians and made them create the most beautiful sounds Alessandro had ever heard. That night, he told his parents he wanted to be a conductor when he grew up. His parents worked extra hours to pay for music lessons. Alessandro learned to play the piano first, then the violin. He studied music theory and learned to read musical scores like other children read storybooks. By the time he was 15, he could play several instruments and had started composing his own pieces. At 18, he won a scholarship to study at a famous music school in Milan. His teachers were amazed by his talent. He could remember entire symphonies after hearing them just once. He could spot mistakes in musical scores that even experienced musicians missed. After graduation, he became an assistant conductor with a small orchestra in Rome. Within 2 years, he was promoted to head conductor. Within 5 years, major orchestras around the world were inviting him to guest conduct their performances. Alessandro never forgot where he came from, but success changed him. The shy boy from the small Italian town became confident and demanding. He expected perfection from every musician who worked with him. He would stop rehearsals to correct tiny mistakes that most people would never notice. Musicians respected his talent, but many found him difficult to work with. He rarely smiled during rehearsals. He never praised musicians, even when they played beautifully. He only pointed out their mistakes and demanded they do better. Some orchestra members whispered that Alessandro had become too proud. They said he thought he was better than everyone else, but none of them dared to say these things to his face. Alessandro's reputation was too powerful. Working with him could make a musician's career, and arguing with him could destroy it. The music critics loved Alessandro because he always delivered flawless performances. Concert halls loved him because tickets sold out whenever his name appeared on advertisements. Orchestra managers loved him because his presence guaranteed positive reviews and full audiences. Alessandro had developed certain habits over the years. He always wore the same black suit during performances. He always arrived at the concert hall exactly 1 hour before the show started. He always studied musical scores in his dressing room, even if he had conducted the same pieces hundreds of times before, but his most famous habit was his ability to sight read any musical composition. Sight reading means looking at a musical score and understanding it immediately, without needing to practice or study it first. Most conductors needed days or weeks to prepare for a new piece. Alessandro could look at a score for the first time and conduct it perfectly within minutes. This talent had made him famous, but it had also made him careless. He rarely bothered to study new compositions carefully. He trusted his natural ability to understand any piece of music instantly. Other conductors spent hours analyzing new works, looking for hidden complexities or unusual patterns. Alessandro just glanced at the music and assumed he understood everything about it. Young composers sometimes brought him their new works, hoping he would perform them with his orchestra. Alessandro would look at their scores quickly and either accept or reject them within minutes. He never asked questions about the composer's intentions. He never discussed the meaning behind the music. He simply decided whether the piece was worth his time. Most of the time, his quick judgments were correct. His natural musical intelligence was extraordinary, but his success had made him believe he was never wrong about music. He had forgotten that even the most talented person can make mistakes. On this particular evening at Carnegie Hall, Alessandro was conducting Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. He had performed this piece more than 100 times. Every note, every rhythm, every dynamic change was burned into his memory. The orchestra played beautifully, responding to his every gesture like dancers following a choreographer. As the final notes faded away, the audience exploded into applause. People stood up and clapped for several minutes. Alessandro bowed deeply, accepting their praise like a king accepting tribute from his subjects. He smiled and waved, but inside he was already thinking about his next performance. Tomorrow he would fly to Tokyo for a special event. A music festival was inviting him to judge a competition for young composers. It would be broadcast live on television to millions of people across Asia. Alessandro was looking forward to showing off his expertise to a new audience. He had no idea that this trip to Tokyo would change everything. He had no idea that his confidence in his own abilities was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. He had no idea that two young musicians were preparing something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about music. As Alessandro left the stage that night, he was still the most respected conductor in the world. But his time at the top was about to end in the most humiliating way possible. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning in November. Alessandro was sitting in his apartment in Milan, drinking espresso and reading reviews of his latest performance. The newspapers, as usual, praised his work. Words like masterful and brilliant appeared in every article. His manager Roberto called with exciting news. The Tokyo International Music Festival wanted Alessandro to be the head judge for their Young Composers competition. This was not just any music festival. It was one of the most prestigious events in Asia, attracting talented musicians from all over the world. "They're offering you a very generous fee," Roberto explained through the phone, "and the exposure will be incredible. The event will be broadcast live on television across Japan, Korea, China, and several other countries. Millions of people will watch." Alessandro smiled. He loved opportunities to showcase his expertise to new audiences. He had conquered Europe and America, but Asia represented a huge market that he had not fully explored yet. "Tell them I accept," Alessandro said without hesitation. "When is the event?" "December 15th, Roberto replied. "It's a Saturday evening. Perfect timing for television ratings. The format is simple. Young composers will present their original works to a panel of judges. You'll be the head judge, along with two local musicians and a music critic." Alessandro liked the sound of this arrangement. As head judge, his opinion would carry the most weight. He would be the star of the show, the expert whose word was final. The other judges would probably defer to his superior knowledge and experience. The Tokyo Festival organizers sent Alessandro detailed information about the event. The competition would take place at the Tokyo Opera House, one of the most beautiful concert halls in the world. The building was famous for its perfect acoustics and elegant design. Performing there was considered a great honor. 8 young composers had been selected to participate. They came from different countries across Asia, Japan, Korea, China, India, and the Philippines. Each composer would have 15 minutes to present their work. They could either perform it themselves or have it performed by a small chamber orchestra that the festival provided. Alessandro read through the list of participants with mild interest. Most of them were students from famous music schools. Their Ages ranged from 18 to 25. He had judged similar competitions many times before. Young composers usually submitted safe, traditional pieces that followed classical rules. Rarely did they surprise him. The festival organizers explained that this year's theme was innovation in classical music. They encouraged composers to experiment with new ideas while respecting classical traditions. Alessandro found this theme amusing. In his experience, young people who tried to be innovative usually created confusing, unlistenable music. True innovation required years of experience and deep understanding of classical principles. As the date approached, Alessandro prepared for his trip to Tokyo. He had visited Japan several times before and enjoyed the country's respect for classical music. Japanese audiences were knowledgeable and appreciative. They understood the difference between good and great performances. He packed his best suits and his lucky baton, the one he had used for his debut performance at La Scala in Milan. He also brought several books about music theory, though he doubted he would need them. Judging young composers was usually straightforward. Their technical mistakes were easy to spot, and their lack of experience was obvious. Alessandro arrived in Tokyo 3 days before the competition. The festival organizers treated him like royalty. They put him up in the best hotel in the city and arranged for a private car to take him wherever he wanted to go. They scheduled interviews with major newspapers and music magazines. During these interviews, Alessandro spoke confidently about his approach to judging new compositions. "I can tell within the first few measures whether a piece has merit," he told a reporter from Tokyo Music Weekly. "Good music follows certain universal principles. My job is to recognize when young composers understand these principles and when they don't." Another interviewer asked him about innovative approaches to classical music. Alessandro's response was typical of his thinking. "Innovation for its own sake is worthless," he said. "True innovation comes from mastering traditional techniques first, then finding new ways to express classical ideals." Most young composers today want to be different before they learn to be good. The festival organizers were pleased with these interviews. Alessandro's confidence and authority impressed the media. His reputation as a demanding perfectionist was exactly what they wanted for their competition. Viewers would tune in to see the famous conductor evaluate young talent. On the day before the competition, Alessandro visited the Tokyo Opera House to familiarize himself with the venue. The building was even more impressive than he had expected. The main concert hall seated 2,000 people and featured a massive pipe organ built by a famous German company. The stage was set up for the competition. A small orchestra area contained chairs and music stands for 15 musicians. Behind them, a larger space was reserved for the judges' table. Television cameras were positioned throughout the hall to capture every angle of the performances. Alessandro tested the acoustics by clapping his hands. The sound carried perfectly throughout the hall. He imagined how his voice would sound when he offered critiques of the young composer's work. The television audience would hear every word clearly. The production team explained how the broadcast would work. Each composer would have exactly 15 minutes to present their piece. After the performance, the judges would ask questions and offer comments. Alessandro's comments would be given special attention since he was the featured judge. "We're expecting our highest ratings ever," the television producer told Alessandro. "Your reputation has generated enormous interest. People are excited to see you work with young Asian composers." Alessandro was pleased but not surprised. His presence automatically elevated any musical event. The fact that this would be his first major television appearance in Asia made it even more special. That evening, Alessandro had dinner with the other judges. Professor Tanaka was an elderly Japanese musicologist who had written several books about traditional Japanese music. Miss Chun was a young Korean violinist who had won several international competitions. Mr. Watanabe was a music critic for Japan's largest newspaper. The conversation during dinner was polite but revealing. Professor Tanaka mentioned that this year's group of composers was particularly interesting. Several of them are experimenting with blending traditional Asian musical elements with Western classical forms, he explained. Alessandro nodded politely, but privately he was skeptical. He had heard many attempts to combine Eastern and Western musical traditions. Most of them failed because the composers didn't understand either tradition well enough to merge them successfully. Miss Chen seemed excited about one particular entry. "There's a pair of Japanese twins who have created something really unique," she said. "I heard them rehearsing yesterday, and their piece is unlike anything I've ever encountered." "Twins composing together?" Alessandro asked. "That seems like a gimmick to me. Serious composition requires individual vision and personal expression." "Perhaps," Professor Tanaka said carefully. "But these young men have been composing together since childhood. They seem to share a musical mind. Their piece is quite complex, both mathematically and emotionally." Alessandro made a mental note to pay special attention to these twins. If they were trying to impress the judges with mathematical complexity, he would quickly expose the weaknesses in their approach. Mathematics and music were related, but good music required much more than clever calculations. As the evening ended, Alessandro felt confident about the next day's competition. He had judged hundreds of young musicians over the years. He knew how to identify talent and how to provide constructive criticism. The television audience would see him at his best, knowledgeable, authoritative, and decisive. He went to bed early, setting his alarm for 8 o'clock. Tomorrow would be a long day, but it would also be another opportunity to demonstrate his expertise to a new audience. He had no reason to expect anything other than complete success, but in another part of Tokyo, two young composers were making final preparations for a performance that would challenge everything Alessandro thought he knew about music. Akira and Kenji Yamamoto lived in a small apartment near Kyoto University. The twins were 19 years old and looked exactly alike, except for a tiny scar above Kenji's left eyebrow from a childhood accident. Even their parents sometimes had trouble telling them apart. The apartment was filled with musical instruments and sheets of paper covered with strange symbols. To most people, these papers would look like complicated math problems mixed with musical notes. But to the twins, they represented years of work on their greatest creation. Akira sat at the piano, playing a melody that seemed to change every time he repeated it. The notes followed a pattern, but the pattern itself kept shifting in ways that sounded both logical and surprising. Kenji stood nearby, conducting the invisible orchestra in his mind while following the mathematical formulas written on the papers. The twins had been making music together since they were 5 years old. Their grandmother, who lived with their family, was a master of traditional Japanese music. She played the koto, a 13-stringed instrument that created sounds unlike anything in Western classical music. She also knew ancient songs that had been passed down through generations. Their father was a mathematics professor at Kyoto University. He specialized in something called chaos theory, which studied how small changes could create huge differences in complex systems. He often explained these concepts to his sons using musical examples. When Akira and Kenji were children, they discovered they could read each other's thoughts when it came to music. If one twin started playing a melody, the other could immediately create a harmony that fit perfectly. If one composed a rhythm, the other could add complementary parts without any discussion. Their parents noticed this unusual connection early. When the twins were 7, their mother enrolled them in piano lessons with a local teacher. The teacher was amazed to discover that the boys learned twice as fast when they practiced together. They seemed to share a single musical mind divided between two bodies. As they grew older, the twins became interested in their father's mathematical work. They learned about fractals, sequences that repeated themselves at different scales. They studied prime numbers, which followed patterns that mathematicians still didn't fully understand. Most importantly, they learned about the golden ratio, a mathematical relationship that appeared throughout nature and art. By the time they were 15, Akira and Kenji had made a remarkable discovery. They found ways to use their father's mathematical principles to create new types of musical compositions. Traditional Western music was based on repeating patterns, verses, choruses, and familiar chord progressions. But the twins' music was based on mathematical formulas that created patterns within patterns. Their composition teacher at the university was Dr. Sato, an elderly man who had studied both traditional Japanese music and modern Western techniques. He was the first person outside their family to recognize the twins' unique talent. "What you're doing has never been attempted before," Dr. Sato told them during one lesson. "You're creating music that exists at the intersection of Eastern philosophy, Western harmony, and pure mathematics. It's completely original." The twins spent 4 years developing their ideas. They created a musical language that used mathematical principles to generate melodies, harmonies, and rhythms that seemed familiar, but were actually completely new. Their music sounded beautiful and logical, but it followed rules that no traditional musician would recognize. They called their masterpiece Infinite Variations. The title referred to the mathematical property that allowed their composition to theoretically continue forever, with each section growing naturally from the previous one. While never exactly repeating, the piece was designed to be performed by a small chamber orchestra, 4 violins, 2 violas, 2 cellos, 1 bass, and 4 wind instruments. But the real innovation was in how it was conducted. Traditional conducting followed the beat patterns that musicians had used for centuries. The twins' piece required a completely different approach. Instead of beating time in the usual way, the conductor needed to follow mathematical curves that the twins had calculated. These curves looked like waves or spirals when drawn on paper. The conductor's movements had to match these shapes, creating gestures that looked more like dancing than traditional conducting. When Akira and Kenji first performed their piece for Dr. Sato, he sat in stunned silence for several minutes after it ended. Finally, he spoke. "This will either be dismissed as mathematical nonsense, or it will change classical music forever." The twins had submitted Infinite Variations to the Tokyo International Music Festival competition without much hope of being selected. They knew their work was different from what most judges expected, but they believed their music deserved to be heard. When they received the acceptance letter, they were thrilled, but also nervous. The competition would be broadcast live on television to millions of people. More importantly, the head judge would be Alessandro Toretti, the famous Italian conductor known for his traditional approach to classical music. The twins had researched Alessandro's background carefully. They knew about his reputation for perfection and his confidence in his ability to sight-read any musical composition. They also knew about his dismissive attitude toward experimental or innovative approaches to classical music. "He's going to hate our piece," Kenji said as they prepared for the trip to Tokyo. "Maybe," Akira replied, "but he's also supposed to be a musical genius. If anyone can appreciate what we've created, it should be someone with his experience and knowledge." The twins practiced their presentation for weeks. They knew they would have only 15 minutes to perform their piece and explain their methods. They had prepared a simplified version of Infinite Variations that would fit within the time limit. While still demonstrating their innovative approach, they also practiced the conducting technique they had developed. Both twins could conduct their piece, but they had decided that Akira would handle the explanation while Kenji would demonstrate the conducting if necessary the night before the competition. The twins barely slept. They reviewed their mathematical formulas one more time and practiced their conducting movements in the hotel room. They had brought copies of their composition written in traditional musical notation, but they knew this notation couldn't fully capture the complexity of their work. Early the next morning, they visited the Tokyo Opera House for a brief rehearsal with the chamber orchestra. The musicians were puzzled by the score at first, but as they played through sections of the piece, they began to understand its beauty and logic. "It's like the music is composing itself," said the first violinist. "Each note seems to generate the next one naturally." The twins were encouraged by the musicians' response, but they knew the real test would come when they faced the judges. They had created something genuinely new in the world of classical music. Whether it would be accepted or rejected depended on the judges' willingness to listen with open minds. As evening approached and the competition was about to begin, Akira and Kenji made final preparations in their dressing room. They had spent years developing their mathematical approach to composition. Tonight, they would discover whether the classical music world was ready for their innovation. They had no idea that their presentation would trigger the most dramatic confrontation in the history of live music television. They had no idea that their quiet, scholarly work would humiliate one of the world's most famous conductors. They only knew that they had created something beautiful and original, and they wanted to share it with the world. The twins walked toward the stage, carrying the musical scores that contained their revolutionary ideas. Behind them, they left years of patient work and preparation. Ahead of them waited an encounter that would change their lives forever. The Tokyo Opera House was packed with 2,000 music lovers. Television cameras captured every detail as the competition began. The broadcast was reaching over 50 million viewers across Asia. In the judges section, Alessandro Torretti sat in the center chair looking confident and relaxed. The first few composers had already presented their works. A young Korean pianist played a beautiful but traditional sonata. A Chinese violinist performed a piece that mixed classical techniques with folk melodies. The performances were skillful, but none of them surprised Alessandro. Everything was exactly what he expected from talented young musicians. Alessandro made quick notes about each performance. He would offer polite comments, point out technical strengths and weaknesses, and provide the kind of professional feedback that established his authority. The television audience was seeing him at his best, knowledgeable, articulate, and completely in control. The other judges deferred to his opinions as he had expected. Professor Tanaka nodded when Alessandro praised good technique. Ms. Chen agreed when he pointed out minor flaws in performances. Mr. Watanabe took careful notes on Alessandro's comments, clearly planning to quote him in his newspaper review. As the evening progressed, Alessandro began to feel slightly bored. The compositions were competent but predictable. None of the young composers had attempted anything truly challenging or original. He was starting to think this would be a routine evening of judging pleasant but forgettable music. Then the announcer introduced the sixth performers. Please welcome Akira and Kenji Yamamoto from Kyoto, presenting their original composition, Infinite Variations. Two identical young men walked onto the stage. They were dressed in simple black suits and moved with quiet confidence. They bowed politely to the judges and the audience, then approached the microphone to explain their work. "Good evening," Akira said in careful English. "My brother and I have spent 4 years developing a new approach to classical composition. Our piece combines traditional Japanese musical concepts with Western harmony and mathematical principles." Alessandro's expression didn't change, but internally he was already skeptical. In his experience, young composers who talked about new approaches usually meant they hadn't mastered traditional techniques yet, and mixing mathematics with music almost always produced artificial, mechanical-sounding results. Kenji continued the explanation. "We have discovered that certain mathematical sequences can generate musical patterns that sound natural and beautiful. Our composition uses these sequences to create melodies and harmonies that follow organic principles." The twins handed copies of their score to each judge. Alessandro glanced at the papers quickly, as was his habit. At first glance, the notation looked normal enough, standard musical symbols arranged on 5-line staffs. But as he looked more closely, he noticed unusual markings and symbols that he didn't recognize. "What are these additional markings?" Alessandro asked, pointing to some curved lines drawn above the musical notes. "Those are conducting guides," Akira explained. "Our piece requires a different conducting technique than traditional music. The conductor's movements need to follow mathematical curves rather than standard beat patterns." Alessandro almost laughed. The idea that these young students could tell him, a master conductor, how to conduct was absurd. He had been conducting orchestras since before these twins were born. No piece of music was too complex for his abilities. "I see," Alessandro said with barely concealed amusement. "And you believe that experienced conductors cannot handle your composition using traditional techniques?" The twins exchanged a quick glance. They could sense Alessandro's skeptical attitude, but they remained respectful. "We believe our piece represents something new," Kenji said diplomatically. We would be honored to demonstrate our conducting approach if the judges are interested. Alessandro waved his hand dismissively. That won't be necessary. I can sight read any musical composition. Please proceed with your performance. The television cameras focused on Alessandro as he stood up and approached the conductor's podium. This was the moment viewers had been waiting for, the famous maestro demonstrating his legendary sight-reading abilities. No one expected what was about to happen. The chamber orchestra members took their positions and prepared their instruments. They had rehearsed briefly with the twins earlier, so they understood the piece better than Alessandro realized. But they also knew they were supposed to follow the conductor's lead during the actual performance. Alessandro looked at the score one more time, confident in his ability to understand its structure immediately. The opening measures seemed straightforward. Enough. A simple melody in the violins with gentle accompaniment from the other instruments. He raised his baton and prepared to begin. Ready? He asked the orchestra members, who nodded in response. Alessandro gave the opening downbeat, expecting the familiar pattern of traditional classical music. The violins began playing the melody he had seen in the score. For the first few measures, everything seemed normal. Alessandro conducted with his usual precision and confidence, but then something strange began to happen. The melody started to shift in ways that weren't reflected in what Alessandro had seen on the written score. The mathematical formulas that the twins had embedded in their composition were generating variations that revealed themselves only during performance. Alessandro tried to stay ahead of the music, but the patterns kept changing in unexpected ways. The rhythm seemed to bend and stretch according to rules he didn't understand. The harmonies moved in directions that defied his expectations. Within 30 seconds, Alessandro realized he was in trouble. The music was beautiful and logical, but it followed principles that his traditional training had never taught him. He kept conducting, but his movements became increasingly uncertain. The orchestra members began to notice Alessandro's confusion. Some of them tried to follow his baton, while others tried to follow the musical logic they had learned during rehearsal. The result was a growing sense of chaos as different sections of the orchestra began to play slightly different versions of the same piece. Alessandro's baton movements became more frantic as he tried to regain control. Sweat began to appear on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the concert hall. The television cameras captured every moment of his growing panic. In the audience, people began to whisper. This was not the flawless demonstration of musical mastery they had expected to see. Something was clearly going wrong, but most people couldn't understand exactly what was happening. The other judges watched in stunned silence. Professor Tanaka recognized that the twins' composition was revealing complexities that hadn't been apparent in the written score. Miss Chen realized that Alessandro was encountering something beyond his experience. Mr. Watanabe understood that. He was witnessing a historic moment in classical music on stage. The twins watched with growing concern as their carefully crafted composition fell apart under Alessandro's confused conducting. They had hoped that his expertise would allow him to appreciate the beauty of their mathematical approach. Instead, they were seeing their work destroyed by his inability to understand it. After 2 minutes of increasingly chaotic music, Alessandro could no longer pretend that everything was under control. His confidence had completely evaporated. His reputation for sight-reading any composition had just been shattered in front of 50 million television viewers, but instead of admitting his mistake, Alessandro made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Rather than acknowledge that he had encountered something beyond his immediate understanding, he chose to attack the composition and its creators. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change classical music forever. Alessandro's baton trembled in his hand as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The music continued around him, but it no longer followed any pattern he could recognize. Each time he thought he understood the rhythm, it shifted into something different. When he tried to cue the brass section, the melody had already moved to the strings. The orchestra members were becoming more confused by the second. Half of them were watching Alessandro's increasingly erratic conducting, while the other half were trying to follow the mathematical logic they had glimpsed during their brief rehearsal with the twins. The result was a musical disaster that grew worse with every passing moment. The first violin player, an experienced musician who had performed with major orchestras around the world, kept glancing between his sheet music and Alessandro's baton. The written notes seemed clear enough, but Alessandro's conducting suggested a completely different interpretation. The violinist had never experienced such confusion during a professional performance. Alessandro's face was turning red from embarrassment and effort. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto his white shirt. His conducting movements, usually precise and elegant, had become wild and desperate. He was flailing his arms in increasingly large gestures, hoping that somehow he could regain control of the situation. The television cameras captured every moment of his breakdown. The director, recognizing that something extraordinary was happening, ordered close-up shots of Alessandro's panicked face. Viewers across Asia watched in fascination. As the legendary conductor lost control in front of their eyes. In the audience, people began to murmur loudly. Some thought this was part of the performance, a deliberate demonstration of experimental music techniques. Others realized that Alessandro was genuinely struggling with something he didn't understand. The atmosphere in the concert hall shifted. From anticipation to confusion to concern, the twins stood at the side of the stage, watching their carefully crafted composition being destroyed. They could see exactly what was happening. Alessandro was trying to conduct their piece using traditional methods, but infinite variations required a completely different approach. It was like trying to solve a calculus problem using only basic arithmetic. Kenji whispered to his brother, "Should we stop this? He's making our music sound terrible." Akira shook his head slightly. "We can't interrupt a performance. That would be even more disrespectful." Meanwhile, Alessandro was reaching the breaking point. After 3 minutes of increasingly chaotic music, he knew he had to do something. His reputation was being destroyed on live television. Millions of people were watching him fail at the one thing he was supposed to be the best at in the world, but Alessandro's pride prevented him from making the right choice. Instead of stopping the performance and admitting that he needed help understanding the composition, he chose to blame the music itself. In his mind, if he couldn't conduct it, then it wasn't real music. Suddenly, Alessandro slammed his baton down on the music stand. The sharp crack echoed through the concert hall's excellent acoustics. The orchestra members stopped playing immediately, leaving an uncomfortable silence that seemed to last forever. "Stop!" Alessandro shouted, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. "This is impossible to conduct." The television audience heard every word. The cameras zoomed in on Alessandro's angry face as he turned toward the twins. His usual composure had completely disappeared, replaced by frustration and wounded pride. "What kind of composition is this?" Alessandro demanded, waving the sheet music in the air. "These mathematical formulas, these strange symbols. This isn't music. This is some kind of academic exercise disguised as art." The twins remained calm despite Alessandro's aggressive tone. They had spent years preparing for criticism of their work. They knew that traditional musicians might not immediately understand their approach. "Maestro Toretti," Akira said respectfully, "we understand that our composition uses unfamiliar techniques. We would be happy to explain our methods or demonstrate the proper conducting approach." Alessandro's anger flared even higher at this suggestion. The idea that these young students thought they could teach him how to conduct was beyond insulting. He had been conducting orchestras since before they were born. No piece of music should be beyond his abilities. "Explain your methods?" Alessandro's voice rose to almost a shout. "I have been conducting orchestras for 22 years. I have performed in every major concert hall in the world. I do not need 2 children to explain music to me." The audience gasped at Alessandro's harsh words. This was not the dignified professional behavior they expected from such a prestigious competition. The twins, despite being publicly insulted, maintained their respectful demeanor. Professor Tanaka, sitting at the judges' table, tried to intervene diplomatically. "Perhaps we could take a brief intermission to discuss the technical requirements of this piece?" But Alessandro was too far gone to accept any reasonable solution. His ego had been wounded in front of millions of people, and he needed someone to blame. The twins and their innovative composition became the target of his humiliation. "There is nothing to discuss," Alessandro declared. "This is not a legitimate musical composition. It's mathematical nonsense created by people who don't understand the basic principles of classical music." Kenji finally spoke up, his voice steady despite the public attack. "Maestro, with respect, our composition follows mathematical principles that exist throughout nature and traditional music. We have spent 4 years studying these patterns with our professors at Kyoto University." "Universities," Alessandro laughed bitterly. "Academic theory has nothing to do with real music. Music comes from the heart, from centuries of tradition, not from computer calculations and mathematical formulas." The television cameras continued to record every word of this extraordinary confrontation. Music critics watching the broadcast realized they were witnessing a historic moment. The collision between traditional classical music and a genuinely new approach to composition. Miss Chun, the young Korean violinist on the judging panel, recognized the twins' talent even if Alessandro didn't. She had heard enough of their piece during the chaotic performance to understand that it contained real beauty and innovation. But she was too intimidated by Alessandro's reputation to speak up in their defense. Alessandro continued his attack, his voice carrying throughout the silent concert hall. "Real music has been perfected over centuries by the greatest composers in history. Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms. They understood how to create beauty through established principles. They didn't need mathematical gimmicks." The twins exchanged a glance. They had expected some resistance to their innovative approach, but they hadn't anticipated such a personal and professional attack. Still, they remained calm and respectful. "We have great respect for the classical masters," Akira said quietly. "Our work builds on their foundations while exploring new possibilities. We believe music can continue to evolve while honoring tradition." But Alessandro was beyond listening to reason. His humiliation had turned into rage, and he needed to destroy what he couldn't understand. "Evolution? This isn't evolution. This is the destruction of everything beautiful about classical music." The orchestra members sat in uncomfortable silence, still holding their instruments. They had never witnessed such a breakdown during a professional performance. Some of them had actually begun to appreciate the twins' composition during the brief moments when they could follow its mathematical logic. The audience was stunned by Alessandro's behavior. Many of them had paid high prices to attend this prestigious competition, expecting to see dignified presentations of new musical works. Instead, they were watching one of the world's most famous conductors have a very public meltdown. Alessandro gathered up the sheet music and threw it back at the twins. The papers scattered across the stage floor like fallen leaves. "Take your mathematical nonsense and go back to your computers," he shouted. "Leave real music to real musicians." With that final insult, Alessandro stormed off the stage, leaving behind a shocked audience, confused orchestra members, and 2 young composers whose innovative work had just been publicly destroyed by the man who was supposed to judge it fairly. The television cameras followed Alessandro as he disappeared into the wings, then focused on the twins standing quietly among the scattered pages of their composition. In that moment, the contrast between Alessandro's emotional breakdown and the twins' dignified response told the whole story. Something unprecedented had just happened in the world of classical music, and 50 million people had watched it unfold live on television. The Tokyo Opera House fell into complete silence after Alessandro stormed off the stage. 2,000 people sat frozen in their seats, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The television cameras continued to roll, broadcasting the unprecedented scene to millions of viewers across Asia. The twins stood quietly among the scattered pages of their musical score. Despite the public humiliation they had just endured, they maintained their dignity. Akira bent down to collect the papers that Alessandro had thrown at them, while Kenji helped gather the sheets that had scattered across the stage. In the judges section, the remaining 3 judges were paralyzed with shock. Professor Tanaka, Miss Chun, and Mr. Watanabe had never seen anything like Alessandro's meltdown. They whispered among themselves. Unsure how to proceed with the competition, the television producer spoke urgently into his headset, trying to decide whether to cut to a commercial break or continue broadcasting this extraordinary drama. The ratings were already breaking records as word spread about the confrontation. Viewers were calling their friends and posting on social media, telling everyone to tune in immediately. Behind the scenes, Alessandro paced back and forth in his dressing room like a caged animal. His manager, Roberto, who had flown in from Milan for the event, tried to calm him down. "Alessandro, you need to go back out there and apologize," Roberto said desperately. "This is being broadcast live to 50 million people. Your reputation is being destroyed." "My reputation?" Alessandro's voice was still shaking with anger. "Those children destroyed my reputation. They presented some mathematical puzzle disguised as music, and when I couldn't solve their academic riddle, they made me look like a fool." Roberto had watched the entire confrontation from the wings. He knew that Alessandro's ego had led him into a trap of his own making. "No one made you look foolish," Roberto said carefully. "You encountered something unfamiliar, and instead of admitting that, you attacked two young musicians who were trying to share their work." But Alessandro was too far gone to accept responsibility for his actions. In his mind, he was the victim of an elaborate scheme designed to embarrass him. He couldn't accept that his legendary sight-reading abilities had failed him when he needed them most. Back on stage, the twins had finished collecting their scattered music. They stood together, waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. The orchestra members remained in their seats, instruments ready, unsure whether the performance would continue. Professor Tanaka finally stood up from the judges' table. As the senior Japanese representative, he felt responsible for salvaging the situation. He walked slowly onto the stage and approached the twins. "I apologize for what just happened," Professor Tanaka said in Japanese, then repeated his words in English for the television audience. "Your composition deserves a proper hearing. Would you be willing to continue your presentation?" Akira and Kenji looked at each other, communicating in the silent way that only twins can manage. They had worked for 4 years to reach this moment. Their composition had been publicly attacked and dismissed, but they still believed in their work. "Yes," Akira said quietly. "We would like to complete our presentation if possible." The audience began to murmur with approval. Many people in the concert hall had been disturbed by Alessandro's behavior. They wanted to hear what the twins had actually created, without the interference of a conductor who clearly didn't understand their approach. "Professor?" Tanaka nodded and returned to the judges' table. He spoke briefly with Miss Chen and Mr. Watanabe, and all three agreed that the twins should be given a fair chance to present their work properly. Meanwhile, the television cameras captured every detail of this remarkable turn of events. The producer decided to continue the live broadcast, recognizing that viewers were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of classical music. Miss Chun stood up and addressed the twins directly. "We understand that your composition requires a special conducting technique. Would you be willing to demonstrate this technique for us?" This was the moment the twins had hoped for earlier, before Alessandro's breakdown had derailed everything. Kenji stepped forward and bowed politely to the judges and the audience. "We would be honored to demonstrate our conducting approach," Kenji said. "Our piece is designed to follow mathematical curves rather than traditional beat patterns." "May I show you?" The judges nodded their approval. Professor Tanaka gestured for Kenji to approach the conductor's podium where Alessandro had suffered his humiliation just minutes earlier. As Kenji walked across the stage, the television cameras followed his every movement. Viewers could see the contrast between his calm, respectful demeanor and Alessandro's angry exit. Here was a young musician willing to share his knowledge rather than guard it. Jealously, Kenji picked up the conductor's baton that Alessandro had abandoned on the podium. He held it gently, almost reverently, as if he understood the responsibility that came with this simple wooden stick. "Our composition follows what we call organic conducting," Kenji explained to the audience. Instead of beating time in square patterns, the conductor's movements follow the natural curves that appear in our mathematical formulas. To demonstrate, Kenji began to move the baton in flowing, graceful gestures that looked more like dancing than traditional conducting. His movements traced invisible spirals and waves in the air, following the mathematical principles that he and his brother had discovered. Even without music, the audience could see that this was something entirely different from conventional conducting. Kenji's gestures were beautiful to watch, combining the precision of mathematics with the grace of artistic expression. These movements mirror the patterns in our composition, Akira explained from the side of the stage. When the conductor follows these curves, the orchestra can feel the natural flow of our mathematical sequences. The orchestra members watched with growing interest. During their brief rehearsal with the twins, they had sensed something special about this approach to conducting. Now they could see the theory behind the practice. Ms. Chun was particularly fascinated by the twins' explanation. As a professional musician, she recognized that they had developed something genuinely innovative. "This is remarkable," she said into her microphone. "You've created a new language for musical expression." Professor Tanaka nodded in agreement. His decades of studying both Eastern and Western musical traditions had prepared him to appreciate the twins' synthesis of different approaches. This represents a true fusion of mathematical precision and artistic intuition. He observed. Mr. Watanabe was frantically taking notes, realizing that he was witnessing a historic moment in classical music. His newspaper review of this event would be unlike anything he had ever written. The television audience was equally captivated. Social media was exploding with comments about the dramatic contrast between Alessandro's breakdown and the twins' graceful explanation of their work. Millions of people were getting their first introduction to a completely new approach to classical music. But the real test would come when the twins actually performed their composition using their innovative conducting technique. The scattered papers had been collected and reorganized. The orchestra was ready. The judges were eager to hear what infinite variations actually sounded like when conducted properly. As Kenji prepared to begin the performance, Alessandro sat in his dressing room, unaware that his humiliation was about to be compounded by the twins' success. He had dismissed their work as mathematical nonsense, but he was about to be proven spectacularly wrong. The stage was set for a musical revelation that would vindicate the twins' years of work and expose the limitations of even the most experienced traditional musicians. Classical music was about to evolve in ways that no one had expected, broadcast live to an audience of 50 million people. In the wings, television crew members prepared to capture what would become one of the most important performances in the history of classical music. The twins had survived their humiliation and were about to transform it into triumph. Kenji stood at the conductor's podium, holding the baton with quiet confidence. The same spot where Alessandro Toretti had suffered his humiliation. Just minutes earlier now became the stage for something completely different. The television cameras focused on Kenji's calm face as he prepared to demonstrate what infinite variations was really supposed to sound like. The orchestra members adjusted their positions and prepared their instruments. During their brief rehearsal with the twins earlier, they had caught glimpses of something extraordinary. Now they would have the chance to experience the full beauty of this revolutionary composition. Akira stood at the side of the stage, ready to turn pages and provide support for his brother. The twins had performed together for so many years that they could communicate through the slightest gestures. Akira knew exactly when Kenji would need encouragement or assistance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Professor Tanaka announced to the audience, "we will now hear infinite variations performed as the composers intended." The concert hall became perfectly quiet. 2,000 people leaned forward in their seats, curious to finally understand what had caused such a dramatic confrontation. The television audience across Asia waited with equal anticipation. Kenji raised the baton and looked around the orchestra, making eye contact with each section leader. Unlike Alessandro's frantic conducting style, Kenji's approach was calm and centered. He seemed to be feeling the mathematical rhythms in his entire body, When he began to conduct, something magical happened immediately. Instead of the sharp, angular movements that most conductors used, Kenji's gestures flowed like water. His baton traced gentle curves and spirals in the air, following the mathematical formulas that he and his brother had spent years developing. The orchestra responded instantly. The first violin began a melody that seemed to grow naturally from silence, like a flower opening in the morning sun. The other instruments joined one by one, each part fitting perfectly with the others according to the mathematical principles embedded in the composition. Within the first minute, everyone in the concert hall could hear the difference. This wasn't the confused, chaotic sound that had emerged under Alessandro's conducting. This was music that seemed to breathe with its own life, following patterns that felt both surprising and inevitable. The mathematics that the twins had woven into their composition created harmonies that no traditional composer would have thought to write. Yet these harmonies sounded completely natural, as if they had been waiting to be discovered rather than invented. Miss Chun watched in amazement as Kenji's conducting brought out layers of beauty that hadn't been apparent in the written score. The mathematical formulas were generating musical relationships that revealed themselves only during performance, creating a composition that was truly alive and constantly evolving. Professor Tanaka recognized elements of traditional Japanese music theory in the twins' work, but combined with Western harmonic principles in ways he had never imagined possible. The result was something that honored both traditions while creating something entirely new. The orchestra members were having an extraordinary experience. Each musician could feel how their individual part contributed to larger patterns that extended beyond what any single player could perceive. They were participating in a musical organism that was greater than the sum of its parts. As the piece progressed, Kenji's conducting became even more fluid and graceful. He wasn't just beating time or cueing entrances. He was drawing the mathematical curves in the air, and the orchestra was following those curves with their sound. Music and mathematics had become one unified language. The audience sat in spellbound silence. Many of them had attended hundreds of classical concerts, but they had never heard anything like this. And music seemed to be composing itself in real time, following laws as natural and beautiful as the patterns of waves on water or leaves growing on trees. Television viewers were having the same reaction. Social media exploded with comments from people who couldn't believe what they were hearing. Musicians around the world stopped what they were doing to listen to this revolutionary performance. In his dressing room, Alessandro could hear the music through the walls. Despite his anger and humiliation, he couldn't help but listen. As a professional musician, he recognized that something extraordinary was happening on stage. The sound was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his 22 years of conducting. For the first time since his breakdown, Alessandro began to doubt his harsh judgment of the twins' work. The music he was hearing was undeniably beautiful and sophisticated, but his pride prevented him from admitting that he might have been wrong. Meanwhile, Kenji continued to conduct with increasing confidence and joy. This was what he and his brother had dreamed of for 4 years, the chance to share their musical vision with the world. Every gesture he made brought their mathematical poetry to life. The piece began to build toward its climax, and Kenji's conducting became more dramatic while still maintaining its flowing, organic quality. The orchestra responded with growing intensity, each section pushing their technical abilities to match the emotional power of the composition. Akira watched his brother with pride and happiness. Despite the humiliation they had endured, their work was finally being heard as they had intended. The 4 years of study, calculation, and practice were being vindicated in the most public way possible. As Infinite Variations reached its conclusion, the mathematical patterns began to resolve into a final harmonic progression that seemed both inevitable and surprising. Kenji's conducting guided the orchestra through these final moments with perfect precision and deep emotion. The last notes faded into silence, and for several seconds nobody in the concert hall moved or breathed. The beauty of what they had just experienced needed a moment to settle into their minds and hearts, then the applause began. It started with a few people clapping, then spread through the entire audience like a wave. Within seconds, the entire concert hall was on its feet, giving the twins the kind of standing ovation that most musicians only dream of receiving. The judges stood and applauded with obvious enthusiasm. Professor Tanaka was wiping tears from his eyes. Miss Chin was shaking her head in amazement. Mr. Watanabe was already planning the headline for his newspaper review, Classical Music Revolution broadcast live to millions. Kenji set down the baton and walked over to join his brother. The twins bowed deeply to the audience, then to the judges, then to the orchestra members who had brought their composition to life so beautifully. The applause continued for over 5 minutes. Television viewers around the world were calling their friends, sharing videos on social media, and discussing what they had just witnessed. Music schools were already planning to add the twins' techniques to their curricula. When the applause finally died down, Professor Tanaka approached the microphone at the judges' table. His voice was filled with emotion as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just witnessed something unprecedented in the history of classical music. Akira and Kenji Yamamoto have created a genuinely new form of musical expression that honors tradition while opening entirely new possibilities for future composers." Miss Chun added her own comments. "This performance demonstrates that innovation and beauty are not opposites. The twins have shown us that mathematics and emotion can work together to create art that touches the soul." Even Mr. Watanabe, who was usually reserved in his public statements, was moved to praise. "In 30 years of music criticism, I have never heard anything that combines technical innovation with such genuine musical beauty." The twins accepted these compliments with the same quiet dignity they had shown during Alessandro's attack. They had never sought to humiliate anyone or prove their superiority. They had simply wanted to share something beautiful that they had discovered together. As the evening's competition concluded, it was obvious to everyone that the twins had not only won first place but had also changed classical music forever. Their mathematical approach to composition and conducting would inspire musicians around the world to explore new possibilities. But the real victory was not in winning a competition. It was in proving that innovation and respect could triumph over prejudice and pride. The twins had faced the worst kind of professional humiliation and responded with grace, dignity, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have created something genuinely valuable. Alessandro Torretti remained in his dressing room, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The twins had not set out to humiliate him. He had humiliated himself by refusing to learn something new. Within 2 hours of the broadcast ending, videos of the confrontation between Alessandro Torretti and the Yamamoto twins were spreading across the internet like wildfire. The dramatic contrast between Alessandro's breakdown and the twins' graceful triumph created one of the most compelling stories in classical music history. Music websites crashed under the weight of traffic as people searched for more information about Infinite Variations and its creators. Social media platforms were flooded with clips of Kenji's beautiful conducting technique and discussions about the mathematical principles behind the twins' composition. In Tokyo, the twins returned to their hotel room exhausted but exhilarated. They had achieved something beyond their wildest dreams. Their revolutionary approach to music had been validated on the world's biggest stage. But they were also saddened by what had happened to Alessandro. "I feel sorry for him," Akira said, as they sat in their hotel room watching news reports about the evening's events. "We never wanted to humiliate anyone. We just wanted to share our music." Kenji nodded in agreement. "He's a talented conductor. If he had been willing to listen and learn, tonight could have been a triumph for everyone." Meanwhile, Alessandro remained in his dressing room at the Tokyo Opera House long after everyone else had left. His manager Roberto had given up trying to convince him to make a public statement. The television cameras were gone, the audience had departed, but Alessandro couldn't bring himself to leave the scene of his humiliation. For the first time in his career, Alessandro was forced to confront the possibility that he might be wrong about something important. The music he had heard during the twins' performance was undeniably beautiful and sophisticated. His harsh dismissal of their work now seemed ignorant and cruel. Roberto finally convinced Alessandro to return to his hotel, but the conductor spent the entire night reading news coverage of the evening's events. Every article, blog post, and social media comment seemed to confirm the same conclusion. The twins had created something genuinely revolutionary, and Alessandro had embarrassed himself by refusing to acknowledge it. The international reaction was swift and decisive. Music critics who had praised Alessandro for years were now questioning his judgment and his character. Orchestras that had been eager to work with him began canceling future engagements. His reputation, built over 22 years of excellence, was crumbling in a matter of hours. But the real story was the twins' sudden rise to international fame. By morning, they were receiving interview requests from major television networks around the world. Music schools were asking them to give lectures about their techniques. Orchestras were requesting permission to perform infinite variations. The Tokyo International Music Festival announced that the twins had won first place by unanimous decision of the remaining judges. The prize included a recording contract with a major classical music label and invitations to perform at prestigious venues around the world. Dr. Sato, the twins' composition teacher at Kyoto University, was overwhelmed by the attention his students were receiving. "I knew they were talented," he told reporters, "but I never imagined their work would have such an immediate global impact." Within a week, music conservatories in Europe and America were contacting Dr. Sato to arrange exchanges that would allow their students to study the twins' mathematical approach to composition. The techniques that Alessandro had dismissed as academic nonsense were being embraced by the most prestigious music schools in the world. The twins handled their sudden fame with the same quiet dignity they had shown during the competition. They gave interviews to explain their methods, but they always emphasized that their goal was to expand musical possibilities, not to replace traditional approaches. "We have great respect for classical tradition," Akira explained during a television interview. "We see our work as adding new colors to the palette that composers can use to create beauty." Alessandro, meanwhile, was experiencing the darkest period of his professional life. 3 major orchestras canceled his upcoming engagements. His recording label put his latest project on hold. Music magazines that had once celebrated his achievements were now publishing critical analyses of his behavior. The most painful part was that Alessandro knew the criticism was deserved. He had let his pride and prejudice blind him to something genuinely innovative and beautiful. His attack on the twins had revealed character flaws that many people in the classical music world had suspected, but never seen displayed so publicly. After 2 weeks of isolation and self-reflection, Alessandro finally made a difficult decision. He called a press conference at his hotel in Milan and issued a public apology that was broadcast around the world. "I made a serious mistake at the Tokyo International Music Festival," Alessandro said, his voice humble and subdued. "I allowed my pride to prevent me from appreciating something genuinely innovative and beautiful. I publicly attacked 2 young musicians who deserved respect and encouragement, not criticism and humiliation." He paused, clearly struggling with his emotions. Akira and Kenji Yamamoto have created something remarkable. Their mathematical approach to composition represents a true advancement in classical music. I was wrong to dismiss their work, and I was wrong to treat them with such disrespect. Alessandro announced that he would be taking a sabbatical from conducting to study new approaches to music, including the twins' mathematical techniques. He also established a scholarship fund for young composers who were experimenting with innovative approaches to classical music. The apology was well received by most people in the classical music world, but Alessandro's reputation never fully recovered. He continued to conduct, but he was no longer considered the untouchable genius he had once been. The Tokyo incident had revealed him to be human, fallible, and capable of serious errors in judgment. The twins, gracious as always, accepted Alessandro's apology publicly. "We hold no grudges," Kenji said during an interview. "Making mistakes is how people learn and grow. We hope Maestro Toretti's openness to learning new things will inspire other musicians to keep exploring new possibilities." 6 months after the Tokyo competition, infinite variations had been performed by over 50 orchestras around the world. The twins had composed 3 more pieces using their mathematical approach, each one exploring different aspects of their innovative techniques. Music schools had begun offering courses in organic conducting, the flowing style that Kenji had demonstrated. Young conductors were learning to trace mathematical curves with their batons, opening up new ways to interpret both traditional and contemporary compositions. The twins received honorary doctorates from several universities and were invited to speak at international conferences about the relationship between mathematics and music. But they remained modest about their achievements, always emphasizing that they were simply continuing the long tradition of musical evolution. A year after the Tokyo incident, Alessandro and the twins finally met again at a music festival in Vienna. Alessandro had spent the intervening months studying their techniques and had even learned to conduct infinite variations properly. When he approached them backstage, there was no tension or animosity. "I owe you both a tremendous debt," Alessandro said simply. "You taught me that there is always more to learn, even after 23 years of conducting. Thank you for your patience and grace during my moment of ignorance." The twins bowed politely, but Akira spoke for both of them. "We are honored to have played a small part in your musical journey, Maestro. Innovation in music belongs to everyone, not just to us." The Tokyo incident became a case study taught in music schools around the world, not just as an example of musical innovation, but as a lesson about humility, respect, and the importance of remaining open to new ideas. The twins' mathematical approach to composition inspired a new generation of musicians to explore the boundaries between science and art. Alessandro continued his career as a conductor, but he was a changed man. He became known for his willingness to experiment with new techniques and his encouragement of young composers. His experience with the twins had taught him that true musical mastery required not just technical skill, but also intellectual humility and emotional generosity. The Yamamoto twins continued to compose and perform around the world, always searching for new ways to blend mathematical precision with artistic beauty. Their revolutionary approach had changed classical music forever, proving that innovation and tradition could work together to create something greater than either could achieve alone. The night in Tokyo, when everything changed, became a symbol of how prejudice and pride could be overcome by talent, dignity, and the universal power of beautiful music. It reminded the world that art is always evolving, and that the greatest artists are those who remain open to learning something new, no matter how experienced or successful they become.